Shalom, and welcome to Tov, the Jewish News Channel. My name is Ruchi Avital, and we have with us today a guest from abroad. His name is Francisco Gil White. He is an anthropologist and a historian. He has a website called managementofreality.com, and he invites you to visit it. And he has a lot to say about a lot of things. He's very, very well versed in Israel and what's happening here in Israel, the Israeli-Arab conflict, and also global trends and what's behind them, the most important part. What is behind them? Shalom.
Shalom. Thank you for having me, Ruchi.
Thank you for coming. So perhaps you could introduce yourself to our viewers and tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got to where you are right now.
Okay, well, who I am professionally is I am an anthropologist. I studied sociocultural and evolutionary anthropology simultaneously. And I became very interested from the beginning in studying all kinds of political topics, but mostly I was interested in the question of racism and ethnic conflict. So my PhD thesis from UCLA Anthropology focuses on producing a new theory to explain the origin of racism. Then, when I was hired at the University of Pennsylvania in the psychology department on the strength of that theory, I became very interested in the Arab-Israeli conflict because they also hired me at a think tank housed at the University of Pennsylvania. It was a joint project of the political science and psychology departments. And one of the main areas of interest of this think tank was the Arab-Israeli conflict. So even though up to then I had not been especially focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict or in anti-Semitism, I now started taking a much stronger interest in those topics, and I began studying the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which meant that on the one hand, I was studying the history of Zionism, and on the other hand, I was studying the history of the Arab-Palestinian movement. And to make a long story short, one of the things I found studying the history of the Arab-Palestinian movement was that the founder of that movement, a man by the name Haj Amin al-Husseini, had organized several terrorist attacks against the Jews in the Yishuv in British Mandate Palestine. And when the World War broke out, well, I should say the fourth of those great terrorist attacks against the Jews of Mandate Palestine was organized with weapons sent by Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. And when the war broke out, when World War II broke out, Husseini went first to, he had been the Mufti of Jerusalem, and now he created so much violence in Mandate Palestine that the British felt they needed to do something about that. So he escapes, he goes to Iraq, where he organizes the Farhud, which was a giant pogrom of the Baghdadi Jews, ended Jewish life in Baghdad. And then he went to Rome, where he was received by Mussolini like a head of state, and finally to Berlin, where he again was received as a head of state and was turned into a top Nazi. They gave him an entire bureaucracy, a budget. He used that to, his bureaucracy was called Bureau des Gros Mufti, because he was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And he used that power to organize entire SS divisions for Heinrich Himmler that participated in the Yugoslav chapter of the Holocaust. These were SS divisions made up of Bosnian Muslims and Albanian Muslims, Kosovo Muslims. And then he became the partner and best friend to Adolf Eichmann. And together with Adolf Eichmann, they created and administered the entire death camp system that murdered the European Jewish population in World War II. So that's the founder.
I think even in Israel, not everyone is aware of Husseini's. I mean, I think most people know who he is, but people are not aware enough of his part in the Holocaust. I mean, there's a famous
No.
picture of him seated with Adolf Hitler, very friendly. And yeah.
Yeah. You are correct. Most people don't know about this, even in Israel. I was able to ascertain that years ago when I made a trip to give a few conferences in Israel. And I was speaking to the people who are most interested in the defense of Israel, the patriots on what they call the Israeli right, the small movements and so forth. They were very ill-informed about this. And they also didn't know that after organizing the final solution, Husseini, he was not tried at Nuremberg. He escaped to Cairo. And in Cairo, he's the guy who created Al-Fatah. He gave Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas German Nazi training because many German Nazis were coming to Cairo to seek refuge with Gamal Abdel Nasser.
So maybe we'll get to that a little bit later. Let's just segue back to your personal story. So you discovered all this material about the origins of the Palestinian national movement and al-Husseini and how his role in the Holocaust had been memory holed out of history, kind of.
That's right. He was erased from history.
Erased. And how did that affect you?
Well, when I found out about Husseini's role in the Holocaust, it seemed to me that the public should know about it, because if you are thinking about the Arab-Israeli conflict and you're thinking, for example, about the logic of the Oslo process, you can't possibly understand what's really going on unless you know about Husseini. So the story that most people have in their heads is this, public story that they were sold, which says that PLO Fatah, which is the organization that Husseini created, it's what we now call the Palestinian Authority. So what they told people was that the PLO had changed its colors. It had become a peace-oriented organization that wanted to live in peace with the Israeli Jews if they could only get a piece of territory for their own quote-unquote Palestinian state. So this is the story that people have in their head.
So this was not a popular opinion.
No, this is forgive me.
So let's go back a little. So you thought it was important to bring that story out. And how did that affect your career?
Yes, so people had this story about the PLO abandoning terrorism and now being interested in peace. But if you know the history of Haj Amin al-Husseini, which people didn't know, it begins to look very different, because the entire purpose for Husseini of creating Al-Fatah, which by 1970 becomes the PLO because they swallowed the PLO, he created Al-Fatah in order to continue the genocide in Israel. That was the entire purpose of Al-Fatah. So if you know the story of al-Husseini, when you look at the Oslo process, it begins to look like an attack on Israel. For the following reason: it is impossible that the people who organized the Oslo process, namely the US bosses, the people running the United States, didn't know about al-Husseini, because it took me only 2 weeks of library work in my university library to learn all about him. It's not as if this information is difficult to find. It's just that they never
you have to want to find it.
In the media.
Number one, you have to want to find it.
Yeah.
And number two, you don't really have to know that, because even as the Oslo process was happening, Fatah was still blowing up buses and restaurants in Israel. So if you just were willing to look at reality in the face, you could see it. You didn't even have to know history for that. You just had to read the newspapers and look at the pictures without reading the editorials.
Yes, however, most people don't have the time or the inclination to do any research, and they're very respectful of what they hear in the mainstream media. So I was one of those people. I was very respectful of the mainstream media, but when I began doing this research, I realized that many things had been hidden from me. So what I did is I published an article explaining the entire history of the Arab-Palestinian movement and the role that the founder of the movement, Haj Amin al-Husseini, had played in destroying the European Jewish population, and also his role in creating Al-Fatah, which the US government was now forcing Israel to accept in strategic territory of the Jewish state, because Judea, Samaria, and Gaza are militarily strategic. So I published an article with the entire history that had been suppressed, and the consequence for me, which was your question, was that I was fired from the University of Pennsylvania, which was very surprising to me, and launched me.
How did that come about? That just sounds like, I mean, what happened to academic freedom and so on? I'm asking seriously. I mean, people publish articles all the time, and this was back in the 90s, I assume.
This was in the early 2000s.
Early 2000s, okay.
Yeah. So what happened was, so you asked me about academic freedom. There's no such thing. That's what I discovered. There's no respect for the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. If you say things that are critical of the Arab-Palestinian movement, you become persona non grata. And the first thing I was told was that I shouldn't be saying this, that I should stop talking about this. And so that was especially surprising to me, because I was doing the job that they had hired me to do. So I was an expert on racism and ethnic conflict. They had hired me to teach racism and ethnic conflict as an academic topic. I had been offered a position in a think tank called the Solomon Asch Center for Study of Ethno-Political Conflict that was entirely focused on ethnic conflict. And the Arab-Israeli conflict was the most important topic at that think tank. So here I was writing a history of that conflict. I was doing the job that they had hired me to do. But the problem was I was not saying what I was supposed to say. I was not saying that the Israelis were the bad guys and that the Arab Palestinians were the good guys. I was merely publishing the history of the Arab Palestinian movement with its Nazi origins.
In other words, you didn't follow the oppressor-oppressed rule.
Well, I didn't. I suggested to my readers that the Jews were still the oppressed, like they always have been.
Wow. So what happened after that?
So the first thing they said is, you can't talk about this. And I said, look, if I have said anything that is wrong or exaggerated even, then if you give me the information that will refute me, I will retract myself publicly tomorrow. I mean, I have no interest in telling lies, so just show me where I went wrong. And the reply was, no, your documentation is impeccable. They used that word. They said, but you can't say this. And if you insist in saying this, you're going to have to get yourself a new job. So I got myself a new job.
So that's quite a high price to pay for intellectual honesty. So bravo to you for that.
It was very annoying, because I was very happy being a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. So I was not happy about that. But on the other hand, I was very excited to start finding out how the world really works. So there was a big payoff for me in that, because I'm a very curious person. And so this launched me into a research process to try to understand the structure of the West.
גדלתי בישראל בשנות ה-90. תמיד ידעתי שהעמדות שלי, עמדות של ימין, לאומי, דורשות שכנוע, נימוק והוכחה כדי לנהל שיח. הכרתי והעמקתי בדעות של הצד שמנגד מתוך מתן כבוד. מהר מאוד הבנתי שהאנשים שעמדו בצד שכנגד לא הכירו בלגיטימיות של העמדות שלי. היום, 30 שנה אחרי, בצד השני הדברים לא רק שלא השתנו, הם הפכו גרועים הרבה יותר. הרטוריקה הפטרונית, האדנותית, הפכה למרד אלים, מסוכן, שהוביל אותנו ואפשר את טבח שמחת תורה. אנחנו בערוץ טוב החלטנו להחליף את השיח המכיל והסבלני של הימין בשיח של הובלה והנהגה. רגשי הנחיתות של המחנה הלאומי חייבים להיפסק. במועדון היחידה אנחנו בונים את הקבוצה שתוביל את חילופי האליטות ההכרחית בתקופה הקרובה. אז הצטרפו גם אתם ליחידה ותוכלו גם לתמוך ולחזק את הפעילות של ערוץ טוב, וגם לקחת חלק בקבוצה איכותית שתיפגש בקביעות ותבנה שיח חדש בחברה הישראלית ותוביל אותנו לעתיד טוב יותר.